Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Patricia Watts, and I am an independent curator. I became a member of AAMC in 2008, and this year I attended the Detroit conference where I joined the Professional Development Committee. And of course, I'm excited to be the first moderator for this 2014 series. Curating from the outside, it may not be considered a mainstream museum practice. However, it is a sign of the times. Our goal here today is to examine the ways in which museums have and will be collaborating with outside curators and academics. So before we get into the discussion with the panelists, we want to do a poll. Let's see here. There you go. So in which capacity have you worked as or with an outside curator? Very simple poll. And while you're taking this poll, because we do still have maybe 20 attendees we're waiting for, which we're not going to wait for, but to do the whole poll, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that we also have assessed that there are approximately 20% of the participants today are independent curators, and the rest of us, obviously, or you, are museum staff curators. So it gives you a little background on who's here and who's interested. So while you guys are taking the poll, and I guess I'm supposed to take it too here. Or I guess not, I'm just seeing it. So some of the new curatorial titles that we're seeing out there today include Visiting Curator, Consulting Curator, and Curator-At-Large. To consider these new developments, we have invited 3 curators here today to share their experiences with curating from the outside. So first, we're going to hear from Dr. Judy Mann. She's with the St. Louis Art Museum. She recently worked with an outside academic to organize the exhibition Federico Baracci Renaissance Master that opened in 2012. We also have Dr. Valerie Leeds, who is an independent curator who has organized several traveling exhibitions, as well as acted as guest curator on 3 exhibitions for the Boca Museum of Art in Florida. Her most recent there was titled Southwestern Allure, The Art of the Santa Fe Art Colony in 2013. And our third panelist is Christopher Bedford, who is the Henry and Lois Foster Director of the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis. Chris has worked as an independent curator himself, although I think briefly, and he is now currently on the inside working as a director who is working with an independent writer and curator, Katie Siegel, who is a curator at large. He is also in the planning stages of creating a program that would invite academics at Brandeis to be guest curators for their upcoming programs. So in today's discussion, we want to explore a few things. I'll just go over the bullet points. Where are we? We're 94% on the voting. It looks like 68% of museum curators have worked with outside curators, and 19% have not so far. And 33 have worked with institutions as an outside curator. These are high numbers, so obviously it's not uncommon. So what we want to explore today is how do we define and value curating from the outside versus the inside? And what are the advantages of both situations? What are the different kinds of partnerships that are coming into the museum from the outside? Academic specialists, independent exhibition makers, international partners, foundations, private collectors and collections, critics. What are the tension points, difference in scale, scope, or mission of partners? And I'm having some noise here. I don't know where that's coming from. So the tension points. So where's the potential for a lack of clarity on responsibilities or final decision making if roles are too close or too different? And finally, how is the phenomenon of partnering with the outside changing the understanding for curators who are on the inside? Do museum staff curators have the time necessary to do the research or to experiment, to play? And is the staff curator's work and time valued in the same way as an outside curator? Okay, we're at 98%, 96%. It looks like, yeah, the numbers are still high in that most of us have partnered with museums as independent curators or museums working with independent curators. So I'm going to hand it off. I guess, yeah, the poll is closed to Judith to start. And each panelist, Judith will go first, then Valerie, and then Christopher. Each will get 15 minutes. And they've been given questions already, which they're going to attempt to answer in their presentations. And following, I'll take about 10 minutes to follow up with any questions that weren't answered. And then we'll open it up to everyone here today to ask questions of the panelists for the last 20 minutes, half hour. So thank you, Judith.
Okay. Yes, I'm going to speak about, as was mentioned in the introduction, an exhibition we did that reached culmination in 2012, for which the work began really in 2003, when we had done an exhibition on Artemisia and Orazio Gentileschi. And for that exhibition, we had a painting from Urbino. The curator from Urbino came to St. Louis, didn't know much about our museum, and was impressed. And with that and several conversations, my director and I thought that we wanted to explore the possibility of an exhibition on Federico Barocci, of which Urbino is very rich. Initially, it was to be a painting show, and after about a year and a half of going and talking to various museums, it became clear to me that a painting show might be difficult to do, but that reading through the literature, one thing that I felt needed attention was the use of drawings in Barocci's work. There were so many drawings, purported 2,000 to as many as 3,000 according to some authors. So it was at that point that I recognized that I would need outside expertise. So for me, really, the decision to employ another curator, we called the position a consulting curator, was to bring in that expertise. I am a paintings person primarily and oversee a collection of painting and sculpture, but I knew, particularly in an artist like this, where I would be looking at so many drawings that really varied in technique and materials, that I really needed someone who had a great deal of experience in drawings under his or her belt. There were several people who had already worked on Barocci drawings for various reasons. Having met with them, it became clear to me that they would not be an ideal people to work with, either lack of interest or having a rather different concept of the artist than I had. So it was at that point that I proposed that we turn to Dr. Babette Bone at Texas Christian University, because she had a great expertise in 16th century drawings. She was not at that point a Barocci scholar, and for that reason our use of a curator is a bit different, certainly, than what had been typical for my own institution, because not only were we hiring her to work with me in terms of researching and preparing a checklist, but we were also asking her to make herself into a Barocci scholar. And for that reason, and my screen just went blank, I hope that doesn't mean that I went off. For that reason, we needed, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. For that reason, what was I saying? well, anyway, it was a different situation working with her. Our museum had some history in working with curators from other institutions or independent curators, people who primarily were curators working with other institutions. We had only worked with academic art historians in the capacity of catalog writers. So we were putting forward a proposal, or I was putting forward a proposal for which we were going to provide research expenses, travel money, and reimburse her for her time for several years leading up to the exhibition. And then we were also going to pay her to write a catalog essay, or actually she ended up, we co-authored the catalog. We each wrote substantive essays and then divided up the individual entries. So for that reason, there was a bit of an uphill slog for me at my institution to present what we were doing. The idea, again, we had hired people with an expertise in a given artist to write or perhaps offer expertise on the preparation of checklists. We had not until then actually assisted in allowing someone to really train themselves in the subject area to which we were devoting a show. And that really it was a hard thing internally. I had to present. Luckily, I had a director who got it. He really understood immediately. He supports scholarship, so he recognized the value of bringing in a fresh approach, a new person, and also someone with the energy who was willing to look at 1,500 or as many of the what we came to believe are 1,500 autograph drawings in preparation. But others in the institution, it took longer. I think looking back, had I articulated maybe more clearly what I was anticipating, it might have helped. I didn't realize how wedded other staff members were to the model that we had used before of a catalog writer with existing expertise. So another issue that became difficult, and I think this also speaks to perhaps two different worlds, two different cultures, is the museum coming to a reasonable expectation of reimbursement. We did, and it wasn't terribly hard, but really we didn't have a model to work with, and we were coming expecting to pay a flat fee that we would for a completed essay, rather than recognizing that we were asking a good bit. I mean, it ended up being, from the time she came on the project in 2006 to the time it finished, there were 6 years of travel, or at least 4 of those years of extensive travel. So that, I think, could have been clarified. When she came on, one thing that was quite clear that I did articulate early on, because from an institutional point of view, I knew it would be very important, was that once we got to the point of the exhibition, the hanging and the design of the exhibition, internally our staff needed to have a curator, not 2 curators. And so from the beginning, that was my task. I was project head, and the curator who was doing the internal design and layout, certainly Babette offered valuable insight and contribution to that, but it wasn't the main overriding person who was dealing with the internal staff. So, you know, to answer some points I know that Patricia brought out, I mean, you know, given that we were not using an existing model, it was a bit of a hard sell to other staff members. And I think always from the very outset to be as clear in the scope as possible, and to not assume that others will understand, particularly when one is introducing a sort of type of position that was not existed heretofore. Because of the need for me to be perceived as the curator in charge of the installation, that's why we chose the title for her role as consulting curator. But really, for the project, although I certainly shaped it early on, once she came on board, it was very much a collaborative effort, and in our not only in our discussion back and forth, sometimes not always fully agreeing on attribution, which is, I thought, healthy, but it really was a shared experience and a very nice collaboration. And having, for us, the advantage of bringing on an outside person was, even though she didn't have the expertise at the beginning, she did provide a kind of expertise in drawings and an insight that we did not have on staff, and so that amplified and certainly contributed to the quality of the project. So, lessons learned would simply be articulating much more thoroughly early on the exact. I had articulated to her we had a contract. But articulating it in-house to others who would understand every year for budget time, when I was going back and asking for more travel money for her, I think for some people that was a kind of a glitch that we had to get over, that they kind of thought. And for our project, we visited some drawings 3 times. The first time to determine if it was by Barocci, the second time to really decide what we wanted for the show, and then once what we decided, when we were writing on particular drawings, sometimes we found we needed to go again because there was a lot to be learned, and we learned a great deal as in the 6 years of collaborating on this. So it was an expensive project, and I luckily have an institution that wasn't dependent on a sponsor for this. We're tax supported very liberally by a taxing district in St. Louis. So we were able, once we signed on to this project, to know that there would be funding to realize it in the manner that I had set it out at the beginning. So, and then I think one thing, I don't know, this is maybe unique to us, we did generate 2 contracts for her. Partly as a public institution, there's a great deal of oversight of our finances, and the feeling was that she was doing 2 distinct jobs, and they required 2 distinct contracts. She was researching and note-taking and informing about drawings, that was and participating in the checklist, but she was also writing, and so that was a second contract that came later. So it was a sort of 2-faceted project, and for the writing contract, that was very by the time she had her writing contract, she was an expert in Barocci, so she sort of fit the model that we had used before.
So Judy, did you want to talk about also the Pulitzer Foundation that
Sure.
You've worked as an outside curator?
Right. I have also, we have locally a small privately run foundation, the Pulitzer Foundation for the Arts, and it's a very beautiful building by Tadao Ando. When, for the first, maybe it was opened, I think, in 1999, 2000, for the first 10 years or so under their director, Matthias Boschek, much of what they did was about the building. And one project that he conceived was, because he was interested in contemporary art, but also had a strong background in Old Master. So he wanted to sort of look at the building as a site for Old Master paintings, do these very beautiful contemporary buildings with concrete walls, minimal decor, lots of light. Do they work well for Old Master paintings? It happened that our building, we had an extension under construction. Many of our Old Master paintings were in storage at the same time that Harvard, an institution to which Emmy Pulitzer, who heads the foundation, has a lot of ties. So he drew from the 2 collections in St. Louis and Harvard to put together this show. And so Stefan Wologian and I were the curators. We 3, he was project head, and we were participating curators. So in that way, I guess I was acting as an outside curator. And for that, it was interesting because in St. Louis, although the St. Louis Art Museum is a rather modestly sized collection, strong certainly in certain things, but nationwide we're considered a relatively small museum, or mid-sized to small. In St. Louis we're the kind of behemoth institution. So we were working with the very small Pulitzer Foundation. So the disparate sizes of these two institutions. For the Pulitzer, this was a major undertaking, and it generated a lot of their attention for programming. For us, we had many other projects going on, and so there was a tension between how we regarded this project and how our collaborators did. So, I think probably somewhat to the frustration of the director, because it was really a wonderful project, and it's been a great thing. I mean, this really isn't on topic, but to have an institution like the Pulitzer in town, because they can decide to bring every specialist in a certain area and put them in the, when they have a certain type of art, and put them sit and have a conversation, because it's a private foundation and they can do things that are wonderful for participants, may not be seen that way by a public who doesn't get to attend, but they often can advance ideas quite well that way. So that was my experience as a kind of collaborating curator with another institution.
Great. I'll have more questions for you on that, but we'll go to Valerie. I'll save them for later. Valerie, you want to go ahead?
Okay. Well, thank you, Patricia, for asking me to speak on this panel about curating from the outside. I've been an independent curator for quite some years, and I've organized over 25 different exhibitions for various art museums and institutions around the country. So I'll be speaking from that perspective of the outside curator. Yet I've also been a staff curator, so my views are very much informed by that experience of working on both sides of the aisle, primarily working with small and mid-size museums, although I do think that all size institutions can benefit from using independent curators. So what I've really taken away from all of this experience is that I've really found that each project evolves in a unique way from conception to realization, and also that each institution has a really distinct way of functioning and engaging with a guest curator. Most often the expectations and responsibilities of the guest curator are laid out by the institution that contracts that individual, as they're looking really to serve their mission and their audience with whatever project it is. And in having a successful guest curatorial experience, I think it's imperative, as I think Judy really referenced, that you really have to have a really collaborative, collegial, and flexible spirit in the way that you come together. And in my experience of doing these 25 exhibitions and catalogs from the outside, my responsibilities have actually varied considerably from project to project and from institution and institution. I would say that the three most important things I've found in the guest-curator relationship are probably trust, communication, and planning. So for a museum to take on a guest curator, there must be a level of trust in their expertise and in their ability really to realize that project. And as a guest curator is not just about bringing a certain academic expertise. The individual should also have the curatorial training, experience, and connoisseurship to realize a coherent visual narrative for an audience that they're not necessarily familiar with. And I think this goes to maybe something we want to talk more about in the question section, which is what are all the different types of curators, adjunct curator versus an inside curator versus the outside curator, the consulting curator, and there's lots of different nomenclature that's kind of thrown about but is never really discussed. So guest curators, I think, are most often taken on, also as Judith referenced, that they're there to bring on a certain expertise that may not be possessed by the staff curators, or that curator is not either equipped or interested to take on a project full-time themselves. And the other probably most often reason that guest curators are used seems to be the lack of time that many staff curators really don't have anymore for the types of research necessary to solely conceive and implement these, major complicated projects. And I think to some degree this has happened for many museums with this widespread expansion that so many have had in recent decades. It's really quite the rare institution whose staff has grown alongside this really rapid expansion of buildings and collections. One reason I think that guest curators are not often used, or nearly as often as they could be, is that institutions see the expense, and I think that's also something Judith really alluded to. However, often, in truth, a guest curator is much less expensive than to add staff or to present many of these packaged traveling exhibitions that are presented. Plus, the institution gets this added benefit of a fresh curatorial vision and this added expertise if they only get it temporarily. So Patricia asked me to highlight one extended curatorial relationship that I've had, and that was with the Boca Raton Museum of Art. It was an exceptional situation in that it resulted in 3 exhibitions dealing with aspects of American art that I organized for them between 2005 and 2014. My affiliation with this museum grew out of a professional association I had with the director, and this has been true of a number of projects on which I've worked, that they've either come through personal networks and through conversations with them about their interests, my interests, shared interest. But anyway, this relationship, I think, goes to that level of trust that has been discussed. In this case, the director knew me, as did the curator, knew my expertise as an Americanist, and they were familiar with other exhibitions I had done. And what also made for a very positive situation was that the staff curator didn't have time to originate and handle these kind of, complicated loan shows, and was actually pleased to have someone from the outside assume that responsibility. Let me start the slideshow. Oop. Okay. Excuse me 1 second, technical. We are, okay. There we are. So the first show I organized for them was in 2005 on Andrew Wyeth. By the way, the images are different projects I've done, some of which I'll be discussing, some won't, but it's just sort of a visual background. And the second project I did was in 2008, that was Shock of the Real, Photorealism Revisited. The ideas for these exhibitions were conceived actually by the director with an eye toward exposing his audience to art and programming in diverse areas that were relevant to their permanent collection. These and a few of the other exhibitions I've been invited to organize were actually not always about having the most defined and original thesis, but sometimes were for introducing regional audiences to art that they wouldn't otherwise likely be able to see. So I think there's a real distinction to be made about this type of show, but I think there also is an argument for its validity, as well as that of the original exhibition that presents a clear thesis and contributes to scholarship, much as the one that Judith outlined previously. The most recent project I did for Boca Raton, which you're seeing rotating now, was Southwestern Allure, the art of the and development of the Santa Fe Art Colony. And it was the first lone exhibition by a museum and its accompanying catalog ever to address this subject. The idea for this grew out of dialogue with the director, another way many of the projects in which I've involved have really begun. He had wanted an exhibition relating to art of the Southwest, and I steered the project towards this subject of Santa Fe, since little attention had been exclusively focused on this important art colony itself, and I felt there was really little justification to do yet another exhibition about the Taos Art Colony or Southwestern art in general. It's also a topic that related to part of my dissertation, so it grew out of knowledge and interest, and the museum ended up being agreeable. But returning to this idea of trust, having that from the curator or director is really key. In the case of Boca Raton, the director trusted me as well as his staff, and he always gave people a lot of latitude, which I think is really a wonderful and rare quality in a leader or director. And over the course of these shows that I did with them over a number of years, I was actually able to develop really good working relationships with his staff members. And this also really facilitates working from the outside, knowing who to go to for what. And sometimes that information is not always shared, so that was a really great benefit. My relationship with the museum, however, came to a conclusion when the director departed, and this was actually just after I was contracted for the Santa Fe exhibition. And the museum leadership elected to move in a new direction in its programming, with much less emphasis on historic American art. Interestingly, I'm now working on a project for the museum he currently directs, so that relationship continues. But staff changes at institutions employing guest curators can be enormously problematic, as new incoming staff may not share those same interests and priorities as the outgoing staff who contracted the guest curator. So this can be a big potential pitfall for the outside curator. Of course, the same thing can happen to staff curators as well. The exhibition did precede the Southwestern one, even though the director and curator departed. And it actually generated interest traveling to 2 additional venues, despite the fact that we had never intended that it would travel. Both the Manello Museum of American Art in Orlando and the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe, an institution that actually played a central role in the development of Santa Fe, sought out the exhibition for their museums. So it was really a great bonus that the show was seen by a larger audience, and it ended its tour where actually everything all began back at the museum in Santa Fe. This, however, is really a highly unusual scenario. As I'm sure you're all aware, most traveling exhibitions require so much time and effort. And the length of time to develop these projects, again, something so scholarly as Judith outlined, this really impacts curating from the outside with these projects spread over so many years. But some projects also have a very short lead time, and as an outside curator, one is generally more at the mercy of the institution's needs in terms of scheduling. The first 2 exhibitions I organized for Boca had a very short lead time, about 1.5 years, which is truly too little for a lone exhibition. And I wasn't even in fact sure that they could be brought off so quickly. But somehow they did come together in the end. Of the exhibitions I've organized relating to Robert Henry, you've seen them circulating, one on Henry in Ireland and another on Robert Henry in Spain. And he is the artist's particular expertise. There was really the opposite issue. I had wanted to do each of these projects for well over 10 years, but there was the search for the right institution to be that organizing museum that had the curatorial interest, the support of the director, and the necessary financial resources. And these can be huge stumbling blocks for the outside curator, really finding that right institution where there's a good fit. I eventually did find inside curators who shared my interest and who really saw the relevance of these projects for their institutions, and that led to eventually bringing me in as guest curator. But this can be a lengthy, drawn-out process, often fraught with frustration, and quite difficult finding the right institution for a project. So communication is important even before an institution and an independent curator sign on together. It's important really to ascertain early on what the institution and the staff person who's the contact person and the outside curator's exhibition philosophies are, and whether they're indeed compatible. And I think Judith referenced that when she said some of the scholars were not appropriate until she found this person that she eventually collaborated with. But once that relationship has been formalized, I would say that ongoing communication is really the single most important factor in achieving a successful outcome, and it's often the biggest failing on both sides, I would say. It's somehow often assumed that the outside individual intuits what's going on the inside if they're experienced. However, although there are basic protocols for putting together exhibitions, each museum has a different way of operating, different staff performing different functions, and different approaches and timelines for producing and designing exhibitions, education programs, and publications. So email has been a tremendous asset, but it can also be a drawback. And if on-site meetings are not possible, then regular, okay, exit. Oop. 1 second. Okay. Then telephone and video conferences are really a vital tool, and I think they're often overlooked in favor of email, whereas I think both should really be a part of this ongoing conversation between the staff person and the outside curator. And this kind of direct interaction is really the best means to alleviate any surprises. And it's often also, I found, through this kind of direct conversation that interesting ideas can surface and that make for a more effective end result in an exhibition. And that leads to another major factor, which is planning. With experience, I think knowing what lies ahead with every step of a curatorial project, laying out a detailed timeline, budget, and responsibilities for each aspect of the project, and also trying to head off any of these potential challenges ahead of time is something that the guest curator and staff contact should together explore as part of the planning process. And I know this must sound incredibly obvious, but it actually happens way too infrequently. So to briefly touch on the matter of contracts, which Patricia has asked me to address, I've worked everywhere from casual letters of agreement all the way to very detailed contracts. And in the end, I think it's probably better to opt for a more detailed instrument, especially if there is no prior kind of understanding or working relationship between the parties. Contracts are usually generated by the institution, but both parties should really examine the terms of responsibilities and payment schedules in detail, and what's constituted by that upfront. And again, I don't think people really look as closely at as these matters as they ought to. And with that said, I do think museums often underestimate and undervalue what is involved on the part of an outside curator in whatever capacity. As part of communication and planning and related to the contract, the guest curator needs to determine who'll be doing what and when, entailing such matters as writing loan letters, negotiation and follow-up of loans, traveling of exhibitions if relevant, grant writing, who writes what and when is it due, who gets photography rights and copyrights, who handles the budget, is there an independent editor for the publication and didactic texts, who is the project manager for the publication and the exhibition, is there an outside designer for the publication, who has final approval for text and design, and how is installation handled and by whom? Is there a formal lecture or docent training expected? And of course, the all-important, what happens if the project is terminated before completion? And these are only some of the, the highlights of things that should be considered. So aside from what is due when and what payments are due, the contract is really where all the possible eventualities should be imagined, and that's where to address any concerns in writing. There's
Valerie?
not really been time to address many aspects about the curatorial process here now, but going into any project involving an outside curator, there should be an openness, a collegiality extended by both sides, and this, I think, strong emphasis on communication and planning, which I can't emphasize enough. But I think if there is a meeting of the minds between guest curators and institutions, wonderfully creative, original, and stimulating curatorial projects can be successfully realized with these collaborative efforts. Thank you.
Thanks, Valerie. Can you unshare your desktop? Yes. Thanks.
Okay. If I know. Oh, apologies. I didn't see that. No?
Uh-oh. You just turned off your camera.
Okay.
So you got to put that back on, and then hit the blue circle again with the square in it.
Is that this?
So Christopher can, yep, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, Christopher.
Sorry.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thanks.
Hi. Thanks so much for both your presentations. Very interesting. I'm slightly daunted by the prospect of sharing my desktop now in the event that it won't actually turn out. So I'll leave that for a moment before launching in. So I thought I'd begin by discussing some of my own curatorial experiences, the basis for the initiatives I've undertaken as a director since I arrived at the Rose. So just very briefly, I'll say I was a chief curator at the Wexner Center before taking on the directorship here at the Rose. So both obviously are academic institutions, and I was very mindful of that in instituting the program that's currently underway at the Rose. The Wexner Center, way back in its history, had done an exhibition prior to my arrival called As Painting. And it became a very quickly iconic exhibition. It dealt with Pulitzer Foundation. I think it was done in 1990, somewhere around there. And the director had engaged 3 curators by contract to do that exhibition, and they were all academics, drawn from Ohio State. And I think during the sort of 20-year intervening period, the institution didn't re-engage that concept as a way to generate an exhibition. But I always look back to it sort of longingly, I suppose, and trying to conceive of ways to engage that concept to inflect the Wexner Center's exhibition schedule. So just before I left, I think in the preceding year, I had asked Katie Siegel, who is a professor at Hunter College in Cooney in New York, to partner with me to produce an exhibition that dealt with the history of post-war painting in a very particular way that I felt incapable of doing myself. So there was I had an idea about the history of that period that was very much about the present looking back. And I was aware of the fact that there were decades, say the 40s and the 50s in particular, that I couldn't account for individually. And I knew that Katie's expertise would take her through those decades and beyond. And through a partnership, we'd be able to produce this comprehensive argumentative history of post-war painting. So ultimately, and this is per your point, Valerie, about needing an airtight contract when you leave an institution, that did not show. But it did prove to me that the concept, if properly executed, could work. So one of my first conscious acts arriving at the Rose was to engage Katie Siegel as our Curator-At-Large. And the means by which I did that was very simple. We just generated a contract. She's paid actually a salary annually. She's not required to be on campus other than to give periodic lectures, engage with students, install the exhibitions, and then have very occasional curatorial meetings with the team here. So it was set up to be very flexible with respect to her and her schedule. And I knew that what I was buying was effectively expertise and ideas, not exactly presence at the institution. And that became, and that we can touch on maybe in the question and answer session, because there are all sorts of strategic advantages in that model, and there are incredible deficits as well and difficulties that you have to address. So I was bringing Katie on very much as a thought partner for me. And she's been responsible for a number of ongoing exhibition initiatives, bigger, touring, research-heavy exhibitions that I think would be virtually impossible for an in-house curator with all the demands of that job to undertake. I also use her to think about the publications at the Rose. We conceive symposia and conferences together, and I think this is one aspect of her job that makes her almost unique. I really lean on her when it comes to acquisitions. So the Roses collection, very briefly, is incredibly strong in American art from the particularly from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and that also happens to be the period of time that's most challenging to collect given the nature of the market right now. So working with Katie creatively allows me to think about how a scholar or academic might think about holes in the way that institutions have narrated those periods, and to look for artists that aren't part of our collection or part of many institutional collections, but do play a prominent role in scholarship. So a lot of her research generates not only exhibitions, but puts in place the basis for individual acquisitions and also more synthetic approaches to acquisitions too. And this is because we're heading into a period of capital campaign for expansion and deaccessioning and pretty aggressive buying. Her contribution is really substantial to the future of the museum over the, say, the next 3 to 5 years. And I'm not sure that I know of a model of another curator who works in that capacity while having that level of influence on the exhibition schedule and acquisitions of a museum while being on the outside looking in. So this is a... she isn't the only outside curator that we're using. It's really a model that I feel really strongly about because, one, we're an academic, we're a university art museum, and thinking back on my time as a student, I was, in my own exhibition work, I've been very influenced by the work of the scholars. So looking at articles or even book-length studies and trying to think how those ideas might become manifest as exhibitions. So I wanted that to become a really expected part of our institution's profile. So Katie's one major part of that. We're asking Christine Mehring, just very briefly, to do a Gerhard Richter show for us. We have another independent curator and academic as well, recreating an incredibly important Louise Nevelson show that was done here in the late 60s. That will be a precise reconstitution of a historical show in the same spaces. So this is a reoccurring tendency in our program. And then lastly, I'll say, and I deliberately waited on this until about 2 years into my tenure, we are going to hire what we're calling a curator of academic projects. So that introduces maybe a whole other level of fuzzy title into the discussions we can have. Curator of academic projects, and it's going to be that person's role to bind together all phases of the institution's activities with the teaching mission of the university. So the person ideally would have a PhD. They'll have a joint appointment at the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Brandeis and be a full curator at the museum, with responsibilities for programming, exhibitions, and acquisitions. So I would say that the specific parameters of that job only came into focus through working with Katie as an outside person. So in a certain sense, the outside has bred a very different conception of the inside for the institution. So briefly now, I'm going to show you, just for the sake of grounding this in something tangible, I'm going to show you a couple of images of what Katie's done. Okay. The first show I asked Katie to do was called, sorry about this, I'm gonna go through all sorts of associated, possibly interesting images that have nothing to do with what I'm supposed to be talking about. Acquisitions at the Rose. So the first exhibition I asked her to do was called Jack Whitten, Light Years 1971 to 1973. And the impulse behind her asking her to do this was a show that she did for Independent Curators International. And it was the first exhibition she ever organized. At that point, she was, of course, still an academic, and it looked at painting New York during the 70s. And again, a little bit like as painting at the Wexner Center, it became a very quickly iconic show because it dealt with a narrative that wasn't part of museum collecting. And if you look at MoMA's reinstallation, for instance, of their permanent collection at the moment, that's an inconceivable reinstallation were it not for Katie's show, which was called High Times, Hard Times. But one of the revelations of that exhibition was the work of Jack Whitten and the relationship of his painting to innovations typically ascribed to Gerhard Richter. And so this show, Light Years, deals with a period of incredible invention in Jack's work that precedes Richter's signature use of a squeegee to create abstractions, and presents 5 years before then Jack working with what he called a developer to produce paintings which have a very similar effect and a similar theoretical relationship to photography. So the impulse here was in part using scholarship as a way to correct the historical record. And here's just a detail of a painting that we actually acquired for the collection, and 2 drawings that have entered our collection too. And very briefly, in the time I have remaining, which I don't think is much, the signature program that Katie and I have developed is called Rose Projects. Rose Projects is intended as a sort of antidote, let's say, to tendencies in contemporary museums to shy away from research and scholarship as the basis for exhibition making. Projects, that term, came to be in the probably around the 60s in US museums as a way to establish a space for emerging artists to work in encyclopedic contexts, and for younger generations of artists to move into that world of bigger behemoth institutions. So with that fight essentially won, in my conception, these project spaces being preponderant in bigger museums, I wanted to turn the term on its head and use it as a way to mark out a commitment to ideas, to scholarship, and to group exhibition making, and to make that a signature initiative at the Rose. So Rose Projects is something that Katie is responsible for. it will turn over to another outside curator and academic when she's finished with her first series of 3 shows. I'm showing you the first here, which juxtaposes Charlene von Heil and Vols, and I'm showing you installation views of that exhibition very briefly. And the second of them will open shortly, and it looks at Magnus Plessen, his very recent paintings and their relationship to World War I and disfigured returning veterans. So it's historical material culture juxtaposed with very recent paintings, looking at the relationship of the figure to history and the figure to the history of painting. And then lastly, an exhibition called Painting Blind, which is about touch and sensory perception, and then the relationship of not seeing to creating an image. So I think that's probably all I'll say about Katie's specific projects, other than to just gesture towards this last one called Organism. And this is a project which will hopefully come to bear in about 2018. It's multiple institutions will collaborate on it, and it looks at the relationship between scientific research and new tendencies in object making from the mid-20s to the mid-50s, deliberately going far beyond visual art to engage research in the natural sciences to generate the thesis. So the reason to do that show at Brandeis is that we have an incredibly strong science department in almost all facets, both undergraduate and graduate. And so it was a way for Katie to draw in the research expertise of those units and use it as fundamental to the basis of exhibition making. So rather than inviting those academics, let's say, to participate in programs once the exhibition is finished or contribute an essay to the catalog, they're actually central to the way the exhibition is formed, the way it will be presented, and to the way Katie thinks about the relationship of visual art to research in the natural sciences. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Okay.
Maybe. Sorry. Is that working? No.
So, are you finished, Christopher? You want to keep talking?
Yeah, I am. I'm trying to return my screen to a view of. Okay, there we go. Sorry.
Okay, you're good. You're good.
So all of that to say is that we've used the concept of the outside very specifically at the Rose to bring the academy into everything we're doing in all phases of the museum, and we'll see how successful that is over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. But I will say at present, it's completely changed the texture of our programming. It's made it much more exciting for me as a director to oversee as sort of an editor or a chief curator, and has made our program feel radically distinct from everything else in Boston. So to this point, it's been a success. I can't say it's always easy, but it's been a success.
So I guess that was my one question was that, you know, how has it been received by your board, by your peers? Like, what's the feedback?
Yeah, so as you'll all know, and I'll just lay this bare, the Rose did experience some considerable problems in 2008. And one of the reasons retroactively that people felt the institution had a problem was because it was disassociated from the university. And it become a very separate entity with a director and a staff of curators who didn't see the relationship of the institution to the greater university as a benefit. So coming into this job, I wanted anyway to engage academics as curators, but this became a perfect platform for that because I also think it was an antidote to some of what had happened before in 2008, and made it clear to both my board, to the university administration, and to the faculty and staff that we view research and scholarship as integral to the work we do as an institution. So that's a long way of saying it's been a really resounding reception, and we sort of knew that.
Well, that's great, and it'll be exciting to see these shows come to fruition.
Yeah.
So Judith, the two between Judith and Christopher, your presentations, you're talking about the size of the institutions. It sounds like you're about the same size, but Judith, now you're listening to Christopher talk. I mean, he's really turning the whole curatorial field upside down and inside out. And I'm wondering how does that ring for you with the experience you've had with your institution, your situation with support from staff and collaborating like that?
For my institution, sorry,
well,
you're a
just
little bit
your
low,
perspective to see an example of an institution that's breaking all the rules. How does that? What's going through your head when you're hearing Christopher talk about his programs?
Well, I mean, to me, everything is sort of project end space. It sounds very much like Christopher too, in a way, and so you sort of, once you've identified where you want to go, it's how to get there. And sometimes it does require, I think we've been an institution that hasn't done things differently. So I think actually my experience with Bracci, and now we're going through strategic planning. We just finished a strategic plan, and I think the impetus is to without being too cliched, but to sort of think differently outside the box, that's sort of thing. And I think in a way, certainly Bracci paved a little bit of that way. And I think, I don't know that we would sort of go to the Rose model, but we might consider our staff differently, staffing differently. After 2008, I think for so many institutions that were hit very hard, arts institutions, we laid off people, many did. And still the idea of hiring a full-time person with benefits kind of makes a lot of museum directors kind of develop a nervous tick. So I think to think in terms of curating from outside is one way to address that, to bring in new ideas, do things differently, but not necessarily commit to areas that may not be areas in which you're building a collection. We often, for example, for our institution, think about fashion. We don't collect it, we don't intend to collect it, but we recognize that we have a public that might want to see that kind of exhibition. The way to, obviously, to do it would be to, if we chose to organize it, organize the show ourselves, to do through an outside curator. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Judith, also, you had mentioned something about not being able to get press or something like that from your exhibition at the Pulitzer. Do you remember?
Say that again?
You had mentioned not feeling like there was much press around the show that you did with the Pulitzer, and maybe you want to talk about that.
Right. Well, again, I think it goes to an institution, relatively different sizes, where for the Pulitzer at the time of that exhibition, that was what they were doing, that all their resources, all their focus, all their programming. For us, even though we were collaborating, we had lots of other things going on. Traditionally, we've not had as good PR, and I don't say that because I think we have a new team there, but traditionally St. Louis has had a difficult time with local press as well as national press, partly because we had a newspaper that used to be one of the great ones and now doesn't have an arts, anybody in the arts. We have a cultural critic, but she's really a music person and has taken on the visual arts. So that's hard anyway. So for us, we've tended, and I think back when we did the thing with Pulitzer, we had a relatively small allocation for doing PR, and it didn't include these smaller exhibitions with other institutions, that sort of thing. I think now we recognize, we put a much greater priority on collaboration of all kinds, both internationally, nationally, and locally. And so I think that wouldn't be done quite the same way now as it was done then.
Okay, and Valerie, would you like to add to your presentation? I know you kind of rushed at the end around the contracts. Is there something more that you wanted to say about that?
No, I think in the end I really addressed some of the key points. I think just a lot of thought and care needs to go into that, and that all goes to planning and being on top of that up front. Unless there were specific questions, I think it was pretty much covered.
Okay, I am going to open it up to questions from the audience, and I'm trying to figure that out logistically here. Entire audience here. Okay. So what are the responsibilities of the in-house staff curators at the Rose, if there are any?
Well, at present we actually I'm a repurposed curator, so I sort of function in a chief curatorial capacity, and in addition to that, we have only a curatorial assistant, and so I've sort of very deliberately stripped back the curatorial stuff to just that. When we have the curator of academic programs, that will be another body, but at present we have 3 or 4 people working under contract on either series of exhibitions or bigger exhibition initiatives down the line. So that should probably answer your question. There really aren't any besides myself and the curatorial assistant. And it's not just purely autocratic. It's also that a wayfinding exercise. I want to figure out whether or not this model is sustainable and will work over time, and what really the responsibilities of an in-house curator would be relative to the beginnings of this other approach to exhibition making, to programs, to acquisitions, and to public programs.
Okay. Boy, I'm getting lots of questions here. Hold on. Okay, so another, and this is for all of you. If you are bringing in an external curator with expertise for something that that you don't collect, why don't you consider collecting it?
Oh, probably to my comment about fashion areas we don't collect.
Oh, correct. And then also same with that same question. If let's see, and if the institution doesn't collect it, why would they try doing a show on it?
Well, in our case, simply we had made the decision not to collect for limited acquisition funds for whatever. But so I suppose what we're saying is we're not always responding to public interest in the determining what we collect, but we recognize our exhibition program, and I think we define our exhibition program as both building upon our collection and expanding and offering opportunities in areas that we don't. The Barocci show is an example. We don't have any Baroccis. We have 3 of his 4 prints, but we have no paintings, we have no drawings. But it was perceived as something that would nicely augment our 16th century European paintings and for our public. So the exhibition program both complements and expands. So in that area, we do, we don't collect books. We have certainly done shows with books in them, so that sort of thing.
So here's a question for Valerie. It's for a guest curator in your situation, you're an independent contractor, you're part-time, full-time. Do you have other jobs? How do you balance the needs of the workplace?
At times it can be difficult because there's not a natural ebb and flow such as there would be when you're a staff curator. For instance, I've just come off the most insane year where I had 4 major exhibitions, each with publications, all up and running in the last 16 months, and the last one of them is just concluded now. So it was just, I mean, in terms of being full-time, it was more like, 18-hour days, just nonstop. So there is no balance. You know, when you're independent, it is what it is, and you just have to get it done because, I mean, when you say you're going to meet that deadline, you just need to meet it. I mean, and that's what professionalism goes to. You just have to get it done. And it's not always up to you, as I kind of inferred in what I said. As an independent curator and contractor, you're really more at the mercy of what the museum needs. I mean, when I signed on to do those shows, they were not scheduled that way, but 3 of the projects were postponed from earlier dates, and they were rescheduled, and it was like, if you want to do it, this is when it is, and you just have to do it. So I'd forget about balance if one is aspiring to be an independent curator. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, I think so. And let's see. Ooh, okay, so here is one question regarding the curatorial at large. Was see, do you have your lawyer review curatorial at large consulting curator contracts?
So we have a team of in-house counsel at Brandeis, and so working within the university is a really useful way to expand the staff size of your museum. So while we don't have an in-house counsel for the rows, we do have this team of people. So yeah, based on the specifics of the contract and the needs as I've defined them, they write and rewrite the contracts that govern the activities of the curator. Yeah, and I mean, and sort of pursuant to that point, I would say, and this is a different inflection on Judith's approach to the Barocci show. I actually do want the curators, the academics, to install the shows. I'm not. I don't want to take over that process or assign an exhibition designer to the process or to pair them with a quote-unquote professional curator from an institution. I want them to try and articulate the argument that they would make in an article or in a book in space. And typically speaking, when I've asked them to do it, I have a confidence that the idea can migrate from one medium to the other, so it isn't an enormous stretch. But it does mean that that needs to be written quite specifically into the contract, so that it isn't just an idea that they feed to the institution and then the institution actualizes as a show. It's a concept which is then fed through loans, which then becomes manifest as an exhibition, which is accompanied by a book and public program. So we're really specific about all of that.
And so this is a question for all 3, and I think it was something that Valerie had brought up in our talking to each other. Someone's asking, let's see here, I'm not seeing a name, Camille. Do you think guest curators need to have a PhD in the field? Any of you can answer that.
Well, I think certainly for us, we put a high priority on the scholarly integrity. I wouldn't limit it to PhDs necessarily, but certainly, again, we usually hire scholars who've achieved a certain level in their profession, and most always that started with a PhD. But in decorative arts, for example, that need not necessarily be the case. That's not always the end degree in that particular field, so somewhat field-based, but in general, for certainly my area, probably it would.
I would say from my perspective, I think it's one distinct thing that we can bring to the field, not exactly as a corrective measure, but to suggest that a PhD may not be mandatory, but it's certainly preferred, and it's my commitment, my observation, that a lot of the most interesting ideas in the post-war period live in scholarship first and can assume a different life as a show. So typically, although it isn't a dogma, yeah, those people do have PhDs, and I'm pretty conscious too of Boston as a site-specific. You could say there are particular conditions at play here. There's a very, very strong academic community. It's the highest concentration of universities anywhere in the country. The self-selecting, educated audience is vast. So it's also a strategic idea to do inventive, academically inflected shows for that audience, because I think they're ready to receive it more readily than other cities.
Valerie. We can't hear you, Valerie. Um,
Um,
there you
I
are.
would agree with what both Judith and Christopher said, but what I would put also great emphasis on, perhaps in certain fields more than the PhD, such as contemporary art, that really I can't underestimate experience in terms of curatorial experience, of really being trained as a curator as also an important component. Because so often I have seen academic shows that just really didn't hold together in a curatorial sense. So I think it's possibly less important, as Judith said, in decorative arts or even in contemporary art. But I think a lot of background, either brought up by a mentor or academically trained as a curator, are things that really shouldn't be undervalued.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would, you know, particularly in using a curator who's academically trained and maybe have a PhD, but the issue of experience, because so often we're confronted with projects that are offered us that are excellent scholarly projects. They don't translate into an exhibition because it's someone who really hasn't worked with the reality of objects and space and how one communicates these ideas through an exhibition. So.
Exactly. That's better articulated than what I was trying to say.
Okay, another question is, do any of the panel members have consulting curators who have worked with their collection or in collections rather than developing exhibitions?
We have a Mellon Fellows program that, in a way, it amounts to that, because it's a 3-year term where we have had them. I mean, for the Mellon grant that we got, it was collection based, so they had to work with collection. So we've had people who are not sort of fully, I mean, they're here temporarily, they have all benefits. I mean, they're here physically, so it might not be quite like a outside consultant, but they work with the collection and did reinstallations. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in our case, that's confined largely to Katie. The other contract academic curators we're working with at the moment are quite project specific. In Katie's case, as I said, she's more like a thought partner for me, and it cuts across areas of the museum's activity. So she'll be involved in figuring out how we're going to augment the collection over the next 3 to 5 years. She'll be involved with deaccessioning. She's involved with shows that are very collection-centered, just as she's involved with exhibitions that draw on the expertise of the campus to make a show that would be, unimaginable otherwise. So she's I would say, a pretty specific case, given the extent of her involvement in the totality of the program. And I think this probably relates to Valerie's point about trust and professionalism, because I know that she's an academic of indisputable caliber. She's also a person who's been around museums for a long time, so she does understand the practical constraints of what we can and can't do, what we can buy and when, what we can think about for deaccession and what we can't. So it's not as if there has to be an ongoing process of teaching.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I didn't think at the time, we had used a consulting curator to reinstall our American galleries a number of years ago, a person who ultimately then we hired, who was here in town, but that worked very nicely, but someone based in St. Louis. We weren't bringing somebody in from another area.
So we have a lot of great questions. Some of them are pretty detailed. I don't know if I can ask all those. We have basically 6 minutes left. Is there any kind of closing statements you guys would like to make? Christopher, Judith, Valerie?
Well, I can say I was most pleased to see that there was actually that much utilization of guest curators from your audience poll. I found that very heartening, because while I've been doing this a long time, when I first started doing it, it was considered really, very, very unusual. So anyway, that's very good news.
Well, to me, partly that trend, I see that the traditional kind of split between academia and museums is changing, and one aspect of that is more academics who are engaging in either collaborating with an in-house curator or being hired as outside curators working within the museum. And I know a number of stories, certainly here in St. Louis and elsewhere, where there really wasn't respect on both sides. The academic felt like we weren't really very scholarly or intellectually driven, and the curators felt that they didn't really understand objects and would know whether they're looking at a reconstructed thing or an actual thing. And so that, I think, this there's a lot more fluidity within the museum in terms of how curating works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would just say that I think, and this is particularly focused on the post-war period, one of the reasons that we wanted to work with academics specifically to produce shows at the Rose and to think about acquisitions, etc., was in response to the rise in curatorial studies programs that have become more and more popular. And I have always felt that formal art history was the best preparation for museum work. And of course, the person has to make the decision that they're going to become, as you say, Judith, very object-focused in their work and use that as a platform for research and scholarship, and the two become one and the same over time. But I think I would far rather work with somebody who has limited museum experience but terrific ideas grounded in history than somebody who has no ideas grounded in history and who's gone through a curatorial studies program to figure out how to secure a loan. Because, there are lots of people at the Rose who know how to secure a loan. There aren't that many people who have original ideas about the history of post-war painting. So I think you have to pick your poison.
Well, thank you, all of you, Valerie, Judith, Christopher. These have been some great examples of museums working with outside curators. With budgets stretched, some museums cannot afford full-time curators in every department. So sharing curators, using independent curators, and tapping into year-long scholars seems to be a very practical solution. Obviously, there's value here for both curators and museums, and it supports the greater curatorial field while adding new perspectives and approaches. It seems this really is an important opportunity for both of us, museums and independent curators at museums, to create these beneficial collaborations where we can reach out into communities and bring in more diverse visitorship and invite more innovative collection-based scholarship. So thank you all for your time, and we hope you found this webinar very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Patricia,
you
very much.